Hi, everyone, and welcome to Changing the Status Quo with Film and TV Creatives. I'm Jazz Tangcay, the Senior Artisans Editor at Variety. I am so honored and excited to be here today to talk to an incredible group of creatives who are making a mark in the entertainment industry. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. First up, he wrote and directed the short film Savior, which won the 2021 Bruce Corwin Award at the Santa Barbara International Film Festival. Please welcome Christopher Oroza. Next, we have the costume designer for Genius, Aretha Franklin. Please welcome Jennifer Bryan. We also have composer of Amazon's drama series Panic, Bryan H. Kim. Next, he is the co-creator and executive producer on S.W.A.T. Please welcome Aaron Rahsaan Thomas. And we have mother and daughter duo behind Cabblow Studios. Please welcome Director of Medical Animations and Business Development, Dr. T. And sharing the screen with her is founder and creative director Kabelo Maaka. And last but not least, he is the founder and CEO of Bridgeworks Entertainment and producer on Julie and the Phantoms. Please welcome George Salinas. Hello and welcome to you all. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. Let's dive right on in. And I want to hear from all of you of when was that moment that you knew exactly this is what I wanted to do? And Jennifer, I'm going to start with you. When did you know that you wanted to become a costume designer?
Well, I think it was an incremental process. It happened in increments. I didn't know I wanted to be one because I didn't know that such a career or profession actually existed until I got a job as a lowly PA in the costume department on a small movie. And at that point, it was like, oh, I want to do this. Really.
Yeah, I started playing piano really young when I was like 4 or 5 years old, but it was never really an option to be a professional musician, like in my family or in the community I was growing up in. So, similarly, it was just sort of like slow peeling back of all of these like obstacles to do it. I went to college to be a doctor and I hated that. And then I started studying computer science and was terrible at that. And then tried to be a teacher for a while and wasn't very good. And so, yeah, eventually I was like, well, let's try this. I think it would be, that looks like a fun thing to do. I like movies, I like television, I like writing music. And yeah, I just packed my bags one year, moved out to Los Angeles just to see if I could give it a go. And that was in 2007 and still here.
Let me tell you, I never wanted to be a filmmaker, and it has never been my dream. I fell into it because my daughter's an animator. I wanted to be a doctor at the age of 8. I became a doctor and I've been one for 26 years. It's just one time when I tried to explain something to my patients, they didn't understand it in anesthesiology. And she then came to the party. She said she could help me. And then that is how she created her pilot in an anesthesiology a setup where she explains it to patients. And then when I realized that she needed help in terms of running her studio, that's when I came on board. It was never, ever, ever my plan to be in the film industry. It was by default.
I mean, for me, I'm just going to jump in. For me, my mom had a lot to do with me being in animation. She was a doctor all my life. And so we never used to go to the movies. I used to just devour the behind the scenes on DVDs. And that's, it was actually Finding Nemo DVD. I watched it and I saw how they did the water effects. And I was like, what do you mean? This is not magic. This is made by people. And I didn't have a name for it at the time, but I was like, this thing, I want to do this. And fortunately, my mom, being an entire doctor, took me seriously and eventually supported the dream.
It was twofold for me, actually. When I was young, I watched John Hughes movies, and they seemed fun. It seemed like a fun world. And, then, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was another movie that just inspired me. Then I went to go get a regular job. I was in the finance world for many years and transitioned from there. I hated my job and I visited a set one day and I was like, I can do this. So, but I didn't write. I wasn't a director. I wasn't in any of that world. So I figured out, I can produce. That's a job I can probably take on. And so that's how I segued from that and moved into TV and film.
My story, as a young kid, I noticed that writing was a way to communicate with people and effectively connect with people. And I consider every individual on the planet to be a writer in some form, even if you're telling a loved one about how your day went, or telling a joke, or trying to describe the process of going to the grocery store and getting certain items. All of that is storytelling to me. I knew it was something I enjoyed as a young child, but I didn't know it was something I could make a living in until I had positive responses from friends, family members who unfortunately sometimes were the subjects of my early stories. And then learning how I could take those stories and then make them into a visual form, which to me was the ultimate way to kind of share an experience with an audience. That brought me to filmmaking and to long form storytelling through television. But now I look at it as the ultimate way to bring people together. So ultimately, that's what drove me to do it.
You know, I always wanted to be a storyteller. One of my biggest influences early on was Sebastião Salgado, who's an amazing Brazilian photojournalist, photographer. His work had always impacted me, and how you can tell stories just visually in one frame. And so I always wanted to be a director, went to film school. When I got out, you know, I was given an opportunity to direct my first feature. Everyone around me was like, wait, bide your time and hone your craft. And I completely took their advice. And for the last, 10 years that I was working in industry, I worked as a head of production, I worked as a commercial producer, I worked as a costume designer, and I was doing costume design for a really long time. And I loved it, but I was in it for so long that I was like, oh, I need to remember what I wanted to do in the first place. And so I was, costume designing the LA unit for Terminator, Dark Fate, and I was doing the VFX costume design for Men in Black International. And I kept getting scripts on my desk from agents that were showing members of my community as drug dealers and, human traffickers. And I said, my community is so much more than this. There are so many other stories that we can be telling about the Latinx experience. And of course, there are amazing examples of TV series and film that don't do that, but predominantly that's what I was seeing. And I said, I need to enter this space and be a part of that change.
I love that answer. And, the thing is, and I'm just going to jump straight into this. I mean, studios and, industry leaders are being held accountable where there is such a huge spotlight on diversity, inclusion, equality in storytelling and the hiring process. Let's talk about what progress have you seen in Hollywood since you've started out, and also just being a part of this storytelling process.
Representation is really difficult right now because I think we're trying to make all these great changes and big changes and hire more diverse crews and tell more diverse stories, all of which are incredibly important and necessary. And it's really hard to find the path to do so. And for me, it's about mentorship. It's about getting people who haven't had the opportunity to tell stories, or costume designers who I know who are aspiring costume designers who don't speak the language, people to help lift those people up. People who don't have the connections. That's the type of space that we need to create in terms of representation. We need people who are taking each other under their wing and saying, look, this is how I made it into the industry. These are the people that I know. High tides raise all boats. And I think that's the step that I see that needs to happen in terms of what we can do as individuals to kind of help representation and ethnic diversity increase, not only in front of and behind the camera, but it's also talking to producers. And, like I said, I was on the film, and you see the casting wall, and I walked over to the producer and I said, every single face is white. And it's, if the movie required that, it would be appropriate, but the movie did not require that. And the only minorities that were on the wall, again, no joke, were thug number 1, thug number 2. And I said, I don't understand. Like I went in almost crying to the producer and I said, I can't be on this movie. And they made some casting choices, and, you forget how powerful your own voice can be when you enter the room.
Yeah. And George, you've been such a champion, of this for giving, BIPOC creatives a platform to actually tell their stories. And we see that, in Julie and the Phantoms and in so much of your projects. Like, talk about getting that off the ground where, you're shattering the stereotypes that, Christopher was referring to. I'm
in the same boat. And the boat was, everything that we saw was thugs, drug dealers, narco, and just things that's not us. So my quest was, how do I get to the boardroom? How do I get to the point where I can make a change and actually uplift diversity as best as I can, as much as I can. So then that's where the little key of the word intellectual property came in. So I went off, for myself to go and, handpick intellectual formats, as we call it, TV formats, from Latin America to now Europe and South Korea and Germany. So that became, how do I say, a process where studios now were looking at us going, you guys have a lot of great, TV shows that we can remake here. What do you need? So that became for us to say, okay, this is what we need. I need to create a platform. Because we don't have that. I mean, I grew up in South Central. So for me, I never had the connections. I didn't come from the world of entertainment. So it was hard to get to the point where I'm at now. But it's also because we didn't have a platform. So for me now, it's very important to create those platforms. And those changes are here because we're making those changes, right? So we can't expect somebody to make the changes unless we're making them. So now for me, it's a priority to have a diverse cast, like Christopher was saying, if it's warranted, that you have Caucasian and whatever else, great. But it doesn't warrant it all the time. So, but again, that gave me the opportunity to be able to make a choice in the room and say no to this and no to that.
Aaron, let's talk about being able to be in that room and making that choice, especially with a TV show like S.W.A.T, where, you're looking at, you're following these detectives and you're looking at real life tensions between, the police officers and, the Black community. Talk about, being at the table, having a voice, and how you're approaching your storytelling process.
I mean, I'll say this. I've worked in Hollywood now for longer than I would like to admit. And what I can say is the change that I've seen has been there are more opportunities now than ever. But the key is looking at percentages. Even though the gross number, there are a larger number of people from around the world, people of color who are now working in the film and television business. What I'm always paying attention to, though, is aside from the gross number, what are the percentages in these spaces? And the percentages still are more minuscule than they should be, whether that's casting, writing, producing, directing, all across the board. So what you're always looking at, because we've had a lot of great conversations over the course of the last 12 months, it's one of the silver linings of a very challenging year last year, or how we're putting actions to words. And what I can say, certainly from my point of view in creating a show like S.W.A.T, is that I've worked my entire career to get to a point where, like George said, where you can have the influence over who you hire, who you bring in. You have control over that space. Am I hiring a diverse crew of people to actually do the work? And it's not coming from an altruistic point of view. For me, it's coming from a selfish point of view in that I actually think the product is better when you have different points of view that can actually challenge and make it better, whether that's age, gender, sexuality, nationality, race, ethnicity, all of the above. The more points of view we have where we can actually put more flavors into the stew, so to speak, I think the stew actually has potential to be better. So certainly in creating S.W.A.T, I created a show. It was about an African-American SWAT officer, which is different from a detective, at the center of a situation where he understands the community that he comes from and still lives in, and also works as a police officer, so he understands that point of view too. And I had never seen that perspective growing up as a TV watcher, as a film watcher. I'd seen many cops chase down serial killers and serial rapists and bank robbers, but I'd never seen a cop really have to deal with the real life dilemma of how do you navigate something that doesn't have an easy answer. And so that's where my impetus came from, and certainly our team has worked very hard to make sure that that is the situation. And even in moving forward, for me, every story that I tell, the interest is trying to entertain and to engage, both of them at the same time.
And I want to hear a little bit more about, the change that you've seen, Jennifer, as a costume designer, because I think one story that everybody knows is there's the issue of pay parity, but let's talk about representation in the world of costume design. And
I was very aware when I first started that oftentimes on shows, on a film set, I would be the only person of color, and I'm going to be frank, outside of the catering department or a couple of parking PAs. Seriously. And over the years, I would say that movement has been too slow. And I think the reaction to change from the industry has only been based on public pressure rather than their internal realization that there were some inequities that needed to be corrected. If we didn't have the challenging year that we had last year, which threw a light on the employment percentages and breakdowns of diversity in the industry, they would have probably continued, business as usual. So it's encouraging, but I think the movement of change is still too slow.
All right, I'm going to switch lanes a little bit and talk about your incredible work on genius Aretha Franklin, Cynthia Erivo transforming. I mean, one of my favorite costumes is when Aretha is crowned Queen of Soul, that silver dress. I don't think there were many costumes, pictures even, of that dress. So how did you recreate that?
For all of those iconic looks, the ones that I had to replicate, because of course, since we're doing a real life person who is, very much, up until her passing, very much a part of our lives, our modern lives, she had an extremely long career. And that silver dress was sort of at the beginning. And I had to do, as you can imagine, tremendous amounts of research. And we didn't have research and as varied and public materials back then as we do now. So my sources were really old print magazines, Ebony, Jet, Sepia, the magazines that basically catered to the African-American community and the celebrities that lived within that world. They were sort of limited in that sense. And as far as the silver dress, there were only about 2 or 3 actual photographs of her actually being crowned the Queen of Soul that night. She didn't know that was really going to happen. And of course, the photo is in black and white. And I had to, with the help of my DP, decipher. I knew the dress was metallic. I knew it was sequins. Actually took a magnifying glass to this old black and white photo, but I couldn't tell what color it was. My DP, Kevin McKnight, helped me, and we figured out that it had to be silver. And so I recreated the gown.
Wow, I love that. And Dr. T, Cabblow Studios, female-led animation. And I think, we were talking about statistics, right? I know the statistic of female animators is so low, and that's slowly changing thanks to, initiatives like yourselves setting up, animation studios. But, talk about, that journey and what made you want to create Cabblow Studios.
In South Africa, we Blacks are the majority, but the studios are white, and we probably are one of the very few studios in South Africa that are led by Black females. And everybody always talks about us because this is something new. The biggest studios are all white. And we decided that we're going to come in with a bang because that is my modus operandi in life. So when you do something, do it big and do it differently. And as far as Cabblow Studios is concerned, you can talk about it.
So Cabblow is a play on my name, Kabelo. It was actually a nickname that I got in high school that I then used as an artist name. And then when we decided to start Cabblow Studios, I was like, let's just carry on with this train. And I finished studying here in South Africa at a film school called AFDA. And I also went to France a little bit at Gobelin, l'École de l'Image. They had their character animation summer school. And I was mind blown because then my teachers they worked on Disney films. But I remember I came back to South Africa and my internship finished, my My university years were done and nobody was hiring me because I was too focused on animation and not on live action. So I thought, okay, I have a little bit of savings and I don't want to be a statistic because in South Africa, we have really high youth unemployment. And majority of us are Black. So majority of the youth who are unemployed are Black. My mom was supposed to be a Kris Jenner type situation. She was just supposed to give me guidance and help me. But when she asked me to do the animation for her patients, I then realized, okay, this is a brilliant idea. I know I want to make movies. I know I want to make TV shows, but this is brilliant. We can combine our skills. I can be in the medical industry without being in the medical industry. And then we get to work together and make the most out of our mother and daughter bond, because we really are close. And she's very analytical. I'm very creative. So it works really well in terms of having a producer and a director in the studio.
I love that. And Bryan, your credits are incredible. You cross different genres. Most recently you did, Beverly Hills 90210, and now you've got Panic on Amazon. I mean, talk about your process of telling story through music.
I've been really fortunate in that when I've had something that's found a little bit of success, I wasn't immediately hired to do the same thing. Because I think a lot of times, especially with a creative who is not necessarily a white person, they might want to pigeonhole you and say like, oh, this is the sort of composer you are. You should then continue to do this sort of work. So for all of these different things that I've had to do, like the 90210 reboot I did was very much a comedy, like a meta comedy. The Disney show I had, Star versus the Forces of Evil, was a very heightened, bright, colorful animated show. And the show Panic for Amazon is a very gritty, kind of violent YA drama in the style of Hunger Games. And so for each of those, I never wanted to feel like I was changing my voice depending on the project. I sort of felt like for each of those, like for 90210, it was like, sit down and ask myself, what is it that I think is funny? Like, what is that part of my personality that I think I can bring to this? And for Star versus the Forces of Evil, it was sort of hearkening back to when I was a kid and watching cartoons. Like, what was it about those cartoons that were awe-inspiring to me as an individual? Because that's really the only point of view that I can bring to a project. And then for Panic, I started out writing electronic music in my late teens. I sort of bummed around all these studios in New York, just like trying to figure out what it was. And so for Panic, it was like, how far have I come from those years as an intern, as a gopher in New York City, now that I've been writing electronic music, in addition to everything else, for, a couple of decades at this point. And so for each of those, it was sort of like figuring out.
And let's touch on diversity within the composer community, because I know, several, composers are setting up, their music agencies to open up doors. And, I think the female number of women composers is at 5%. It's a shocking, and it actually went down last year. Mm-hmm. So, share your story of diversity within.
Yeah, when especially this past year, a lot of AAPI composers started emailing each other. We had a big Zoom gathering a couple of months ago just to talk about, issues that we saw in the greater Asian American community, obviously, and then how we could work within our community to bring more visibility. To be fair, when you think of a film or a TV composer, there's not a lot of name recognition or visual recognition where it's not like a really famous film composer can walk down the street and then get mobbed, that's not really the sort of position that we're in. But it's more like we just need to work more and get our name out there more, so that when people are watching a show and they see the name in the credits, they'll see a Kim or a Cho or a Yang or a Kang or something like that. And that sort of thing, if we just keep on doing that and that keeps on existing, then you can sort of chip away at any sort of barrier that somebody might have in not knowing who an Asian person is. And I think that's sort of the role that we can play. And so I think it's just that constant exposure, not necessarily having a big event film like Crazy Rich Asians, but being so present that when something like Crazy Rich Asians comes out, it's not an event. It's just, oh, this is another representation of our community in America. This is not some big anomaly that doesn't exist regularly. And so I think if we can all be working towards that, then I think composers will just be a part of that greater tapestry in Los Angeles, just trying to make a difference through that.
Yeah, I love that because it's so true. Like right now we're in this phase of like so many firsts. Like, you know, Ruth Carter was the first African American to win a costume, you know, an Oscar for costume design. She was the first, you know, African American costume designer to get a star on the Walk of Fame. And, you know, like when Parasite and Minari, like they were all first. And I mean, that just leads to the question, like, what do you think we can do, or, you know, you can do to, I guess, you know, empower those underrepresented voices, not just in front of the camera, but behind the camera? Like, let's talk about initiatives and what needs to be done.
I think it is our responsibility, and our meaning those of us that have been able to chip away at the glass ceiling and made some inroads. I think it's our responsibility, if we take it on as a personal responsibility, to lift and educate and bring other people who are trying to get into this business, that have a talent and a thirst for it, bring them up. If you got your way up on the elevator, then you need to send it. I always like to say this, you send the elevator back down to get the next load to elevate and to bring up. We shouldn't just think, okay, I got a break, I got my foot in the door and I'm going to do my thing. But part of doing your thing is being global about it. And I was just thinking about The Good Doctor and her daughter. You know, I have to say, I've been to South Africa, Johannesburg, loved it. And being a film person and knowing that you guys have a film industry there, I was painfully aware that there weren't any studios, Black studios, or the percentages of the real population versus the population that controls your film industry was totally out of whack.
Yep.
And to a lesser extent, so it is in the United States. We are grossly underrepresented, and that's one of the things we need to do.
George, you know, you're helping fix things with your storytelling, you know, and Julie and the Phantoms being on Netflix, global audience. Like, talk about having a home such as Netflix to bring that story to the world, and, you know, what else can be done to uplift.
No, absolutely. I mean, even going to Netflix was a fight, right? I mean, it's not an easy battle, but it's a battle, and it's a battle that I'm okay with, because the thing is, when you have what they want, it's really hard for them to say no to you. So that's the position that I wanted to be in, and it took me a while. It took me over 3 years, because I went pretty much around all Latin America just to find these TV formats to come in and say, I have handpicked the best of the best from Spain, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia. But right after that, we just said, why are we limited? I mean, I speak Spanish, but my first language is English, but I spoke both at the same time, so I'm fluent in both. So we moved over to Italy, Germany, South Korea. And so that being said, is, you know, we created something where, again, it's going to be hard for them to say no. And so when we started casting it and even putting the room together, that was my biggest priority, was diversity. You know, this has to be diverse, period. I don't care if we have to bring or make someone. So our lead, which is Madison, she came from Pennsylvania, never acted, never done anything. She was actually going to school the next semester before COVID, obviously. And she got the part, and it took a minute to convince Netflix, but they actually said yes. And from there on, it created her to become, you know, a success. And so what I started doing, I just started seeing the need. So recently we created a little side management side to our company. Happened to be, we signed a girl named Melissa Barrera, who's now in the Heights. And then we have creators, we have some writers that we're uplifting, you know. And when I say that, I mean, we're looking at everyone, right? Because we look at everything. So that's from, you know, African Americans, Asians, you know, Latinx. It doesn't matter. If you have a big voice, we're for sure going to give you that platform, because we can, you know, because we can actually walk in with what we call a full package.
You know, Aaron, for you, you know, S.W.A.T is on a major network. You know, talk about what you're doing to, empower underrepresented voices, and what can we do
Yeah,
to elevate that?
what I can tell you, it's certainly a passion, I think, of all of ours in order to be here to discuss this, of wanting to improve our industries wherever they are, throughout the world. Certainly for my priority on S.W.A.T and even projects beyond S.W.A.T, the thing that I'm always looking to do is, how do you change your space? We can only affect what we do as individuals. But when you are empowered, when you're in a position of influence, I think if you have a desire to change things at all, then your responsibility is greater than simply entertaining or simply conveying information. Some can look at that as unfair, but it is what it is. So if you really have a desire to change things, then it is also on you to take on basically a second job of making sure that you're not only sending the elevator back down, but also providing an infrastructure for those to thrive. People of color, diverse points of view. And again, diversity goes across a lot of different platforms. So it's not just gender, ethnicity. We're talking about class. We're talking about nationality. We're talking about religion. I know for myself, as I develop projects, each of those projects is done with an intent to make sure that the people behind the scenes, the cameramen, the writers, the makeup people, the wardrobe people, the editors, all reflect the diversity of our world in an organic way to actually make the product better. So it's not just simply diversity for diversity's sake. It's also diversity so that when I argue, or if I have to argue with the studio or network or the money people, so to speak, what I'm laying out is why this product will be better because of the points of view that I'm bringing in. Not simply eat your vegetables, but this is actually smart business, and I'll show you why. So as I develop and look at multiple projects, all of it springboards off of what I did, on S.W.A.T, which is to look at not just diversity in front of the screen, but diversity behind the scenes, and look at what true diversity is. Different points of view that can collaborate and make things better.
Here in South Africa, we have the habit of making stories that are very derivative. And we've been running a residency program where we've had 5 artists join us for 3 months to do a virtual residency. And what I've been finding that I have to do with all of them, because they're male, female, different races, because we have lots of different ethnic groups in South Africa. And what I've been finding I have to do with them is, instead of making their animations like something they've already seen before, I've been telling them to use their own lives and experiences and their own worlds as a reference. The way that it looks in the township at night, instead of doing a generic day scene, what does it look like in the township during the day? Or if you live in Cape Town and by the beach, what does that look like as compared to a beach anywhere else in the world? So that's also, you were saying, building the infrastructure. Through our residency, we're also trying to get you to think that your world and your experiences are actually worth telling and showing to people, and people will actually relate elsewhere in the world.
Yeah. And to add to that, to use ordinary voices. I mean, in our film, 3 Teaspoons of Sugar, we use my voice and Kabelow's voice.
My grandmother.
And my mom's voice, because, everybody has a voice. Like you said earlier, that, Aaron, that everybody is a writer, can tell a story. So I also believe everybody has a voice and every voice can be used. So I am developing this industry in our country by the residency, by using ordinary voices, but also encouraging mothers to support their children, especially Black children, that they can take their children to go and be in the entertainment industry. I mean, there was another summit last week where one CEO of an animation school in South Africa was saying that parents in South Africa don't allow their children to enter into animation, and in fact they disown their children. And I took it upon myself to say, I will make talks at those universities to encourage mothers to then allow their children to go into animation so that we can grow this sport. Because in South Africa, there's very few animators, but Black animators, far and few in between. So that besides just growing the industry, we have to let young ones get in, and the parents have to let go. Like my mother did not want my sister to be a singer, but when her daughter wanted to be a singer, I made sure that she became a singer, and then she could also then become an animator. So there's different ways in which we can grow the industry and make sure that the people that need to be in the industry are there.
I love that. And the one thing, with all of you in the work that you're doing, people are seeing themselves at home. They're finally seeing representations of themselves on screen. And it's something that's been lacking for so long. Finally, you're hearing, I feel seen, I feel represented. So for those, and, this just touches on what you just said, is, for those trying to get into the industry or looking what to do next, like, what would you like to tell them? Christopher, I'm going to start with you. For those trying to get into...
I tell them to dream big and follow in the path. And I've been so blessed with mentors who I have sought out and asked for help and said, please, teach me, make me better. You always have something to learn, and you will never stop learning within this industry. You may think that your story is the most incredible thing in the world. Great. Almost every person in the population thinks that, but you have to go after it with every part of your being and believe that you have that unique voice, because we do need all those individual perspectives. The Latinx experience is not a monolith. The queer experience is not a monolith. The Black experience is not a monolith. All of us have individual stories and experiences that no one else has lived. And exactly like you were saying, everybody's perspective is so valued. And also, people don't know what they want until they see it. There's so much new that exists just by tapping into these different groups. And, I think about all the communities in my country, in Bolivia, the trans community, the indigenous community. I mean, the stories that are there are so rich and incredible and have never left the border, and so it's up to us to help uplift those people and share their stories too. So just never believe that you cannot do it. Just keep pushing forward and find the people that will extend a hand and learn every single day.
Yeah. I'm curious what, whilst you're talking about, your mentors, for Xavier, like, what was the inspiration for that? And, and how does it relate to film and TV that you're wishing to champion, that we've been talking about here today as a Latinx storyteller?
Well, the film was birthed from the division that has forever existed in this country, and birthed by the unending violence that we've seen on minority communities that we have faced and continue to face. For me, it was when Patrick Chrysius entered a Walmart in El Paso and murdered 23 people, most of whom were Latino. And that's specifically who he was targeting. And so the film explores the cyclical nature of the bloodshed and the division that has existed in this country through the rhetoric of our past leaders, and shows that we have not come at all that far. The problems of yesterday are the problems of today. And so when elected leaders call migrants murderers, rapists, and felons, that dishonest and cruel rhetoric enters the public consciousness. The truth is, honest representation saves lives. So, the Latinx community is the second largest ethnic group in America, and yet we were grossly underrepresented in front of and behind the camera. And like I said before, when we are represented, it's stereotyped. And of course, there are people in this room who are doing amazing things to change that. And, I want to be part of that change. So for me as a writer, or when I want to direct something, it's not only highlighting the obstacles of my communities, or marginalized communities, because the struggle is real, but it's also celebrating the universal stories of joy, of love, and adventure across genres, so that we break down those boundaries and we meet at the center of experience and go, oh, wow, there's a queer Latinx lead and he's in this romantic comedy, and the movie doesn't mention anything about his race or sexuality once, and he's just there and he's alive. And, that's where we see ourselves on the path to true representation. And that's what I want to be a part of. So, over the last 10 years, writing my projects and creating a slate to finally go out with now, and with Xavier being the first thing that I directed now that I've officially transitioned into this path, and having it be Oscar qualified was a huge honor and wake-up call for me to say, yeah, this is what you should be doing. Why aren't we sharing these stories that are so essential for us to understand and bring ourselves closer together to realize that we are all human, valid representations out of love and life in this world? And I think that's, what I really strive for in my work and hope to continue to do.
Bryan, what about for you? What would you say to aspiring musicians, composers out there looking to get into the field of music composition?
I think especially in immigrant families, like my parents were immigrants and they came here, with nothing, and their primary concern, to no fault of them, was that a job was a way to provide for your family. And so I think in the communities that I was growing up in, and I think in many immigrant communities, the idea of like an Asian American creative is like a paradox or an oxymoron. Like it shouldn't really exist. And I think for me when I was younger, and I think maybe for a lot of other younger people, that idea can feel like, oh, I'm not strong enough to repress this will that I have in me. So like I'm a little bit too weak. I can't. So I really shouldn't be doing this, or that it makes you weird that you want to do that thing. But I think because, there are so many people before you who could not do this thing, who maybe wanted to. The fact that you want to do this thing doesn't make you a weirdo and doesn't make you weak. It makes you special. It makes you somebody who's going to buck the trend. It makes you like, don't feel that because you're a paradox that makes you strange or lesser than. Like being a paradox makes you powerful. I think being a paradox is what should give you that forward momentum to do what it is that you want to do and say, I'm going to ignore the history behind this, the people telling me that I can't do this, not necessarily the history, but the people telling me that I can't do this because this is what I want to do, and find your momentum from that. Don't see that as a burden. See that as a reason to push harder.
And I know Chris touched briefly on what he was working on next, but Dr. T would love to hear what's coming next from the studios.
Yeah, so the 5 residents that we're working with, we're going to help them distribute their short films. So I can't say what they are yet, but we are going to do a mini film festival for them, an online. Oh, well, we'll see if we can meet in person, but we're going to do a mini online film festival to show their 5 films that they've been doing in the residency. And then we also have 2 productions that are in development. One is a kids show, and then one is a teen show, and they're both musicals. And yeah, we just realized after doing 3 teaspoons of sugar and it's going to Annecy and surprising us. And then everyone was like, okay, what do you have? And we were like, oh, okay, we need to come up with hundreds of ideas. So then we 2020 actually ended up being so busy for us because of that one short film that we decided we'd help other people make short films, but then we'd also start to come up with our own original IP. And yes, it was George who said it is IP that is a really important conversation piece as a person who's from a diverse background. And so we realized, okay, cool, let's maximize on this IP and make as many things as possible. We'll see which one comes to fruition. Yeah.
Love that. And lastly, George, what do you have in store for audiences next?
Well, the thing that I can say is, we have a rom-com, a drama, sci-fi, and in animation from a comic book that we're adapting. All of them were in negotiations right now to basically get done. In the sense they're at studios, networks, some are in streamers. And hopefully the other thing is too, Julie and the Phantoms, we get a second season and we can, keep bringing that, that great show on the air.
Love it. Watch this space. Well, I could keep on going and asking, keep hearing from all of you, but that is all we have time today. So I want to say thank you to this incredible panel, and thank you, Christopher, thank you, Aaron, thank you, Bryan, thank you, Dr. T, Kabelo, George, Jennifer, for sharing your incredible process and insight and that incredible conversation. Thank you to Impact 24 PR and of course Comic-Con for putting this panel together. And finally, thank you to everybody for tuning in today, and we will see you soon.